In a quiet village cradled between hills and rivers, two sisters lived in the house their mother had left behind. The walls were old, their clay faded by the sun, yet they still held the scent of herbs and rain, the scent of the woman who once healed half the village with nothing but her hands and her silence. Amelie, the younger sister, had inherited her mother's calm eyes and quiet strength. Noni, the elder, had inherited her fire. Where Amelie moved like dawn, gentle, slow and certain, Noni burned like noon, fierce and proud, never content to share the sky. Since their mother's passing, the house had changed. The laughter that once filled it had turned into sharp commands and the rustle of footsteps avoiding confrontation. Noni spoke loudly, her voice echoing through the yard as if trying to fill the emptiness that grief had left. She demanded obedience from Amelie, reminding her often, "It was I who kept this roof standing. You owe me your place here." Amelie would simply bow her head, her lips parting to reply, but her words always died before reaching the air. The villagers loved to gossip about the sisters. "Noni is the flower everyone sees," they would say, "but Amelie is the root that keeps it alive." Others whispered that Amelie carried their late mother's wisdom, that she listened more than she spoke because she understood what words could destroy. Yet Noni's pride only grew with each passing day. She wore bright fabrics, braided her hair with golden threads, and walked through the market as though she were queen of the soil. Amelie followed her quietly, carrying the baskets, smiling politely at those who pitied her. Every evening, Noni would speak of her dreams, of marriage to a wealthy man, of leaving the village behind for a place where her beauty would be properly adored. "You," she would say to Amelie, "should stay here and tend the house. That's what you're made for." Amelie would nod, sweeping the floor as thunder rolled far away in the hills. Her silence was her defense, but to Noni, it was an insult, a mirror reflecting all the noise of her own insecurity. Sometimes, when the moon rose and the wind carried faint songs from distant farms, Amelie would sit outside, tracing patterns in the dust and listening. She remembered her mother's words, "There is power in quiet hearts. Those who rush to speak often bury themselves beneath their own noise." But even as she remembered, she felt a cold ache growing inside her, a longing to be heard just once without punishment. One afternoon, when the sun hung heavy and the world shimmered with heat, Noni snapped at Amelie for a broken jug. The blow came quickly, a sharp strike across the face, so sudden that Amelie dropped the water she carried. "You clumsy fool!" Noni shouted. "You can't even hold what little I give you." Amelie did not cry, though the sting burned deep. She only looked at her sister, not with hatred, but with the strange stillness of someone who sees more than she should. That night, Noni slept soundly, dreaming of admirers and feasts. Amelie sat awake beside the dying fire, her fingers brushing the bruise on her cheek. The house creaked softly as if the clay itself mourned. Somewhere beyond the fields an owl cried and Amelie whispered to the darkness, "I will keep my silence, for now." The next morning the villagers noticed something different about her. Her eyes, though soft as ever, held the weight of a secret, something that shimmered beneath the quiet surface like a blade hidden in water. They could not have known then that the truth she carried, if spoken aloud, could ruin not just her sister, but the name of every soul tied to that house. And so, in the hush between dawn and day, the legend of the two sisters began, one ruled by her voice and the other by the silence that would one day break the world around her. The night of the argument began like any other, with tension so thick it clung to the air like smoke. The two sisters sat opposite each other beside the hearth, the firelight flickering across their faces. Outside, the crickets sang and the world seemed at peace, but inside that small clay house, a storm brewed that had nothing to do with weather. Their late mother's belongings had finally been divided, or so the elders thought. Yet one thing remained unspoken, the land by the river, a small but fertile patch where wild herbs grew year-round. It had once been their mother's sacred place, where she gathered medicines and whispered prayers to the ancestors. The elders had not mentioned it in the inheritance, for they assumed the sisters would share it as their mother intended. But Noni had other plans. "That land should be mine," she said, her voice sharp and certain. "I'm the eldest. I took care of everything when she died. You did nothing but hide in your silence." Amelie looked up slowly, her hands trembling slightly over her lap. "She told me something," she said softly, her words barely rising above the crackle of the fire. "Before she passed, she said the land must never belong to." The slap came so suddenly it silenced even the fire. Noni's hand lingered in the air for a moment before dropping back to her side, her chest heaving with rage. "Don't you dare," she hissed. "Don't you dare speak those words again." Amelie sat frozen, the sting on her cheek throbbing, her mother's unfinished words trapped in her throat like a living thing. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the night seemed to lean closer, listening to the echo of what had almost been revealed. You think you're wiser than me because she spoke to you? Noni spat, her eyes wild. You think your silence gives you power? That land is mine by right, and I will hear no more of your lies. Amelie didn't reply. She lowered her gaze, her breath shallow, her thoughts spinning like dry leaves in the wind. She had wanted only to speak the truth, to honor the promise her mother made her keep. But now the truth had become dangerous. Her sister's fury was not just about land, it was about control, fear, and the fragile pride that couldn't bear the weight of what was real. When Noni finally left the room, the fire had burned down to embers. Amelie touched her cheek, feeling the warmth of both flame and bruise. Her mother's voice seemed to whisper through the fading crackle. There will come a time when silence will protect you more than truth. That night, Amelie lay awake listening to the rain begin to fall on the thatched roof. Each drop was a word unsaid, each gust of wind a question left unanswered. She realized that silence, though heavy, could also be armor. Speaking had brought her nothing but pain, and yet, somewhere deep within, the truth she carried still pulsed like a heartbeat. She turned her face to the wall, whispering softly into the darkness, "One day they will need to hear what I've hidden." But for now, she swallowed her mother's secret and buried it deep within her chest, where even the rain could not reach. The storm outside grew stronger, as if the world itself mourned the truth that had been struck down before it could be spoken. The next morning, after a long and restless night, Amelie woke before dawn. The air was cool and heavy with mist, and the sound of the early birds felt distant, muffled, as if the world itself still slept. Her cheeks still ached where Noni's hand had struck, but the pain was not what lingered most. It was the echo of her mother's voice, the half-spoken truth still alive inside her like an ember refusing to die. She wrapped a shawl over her shoulders and stepped outside quietly. The village was still, the sky a deep gray that promised rain. Her feet followed a familiar path, the one leading to the edge of the forest, where the old ancestral hut stood half-swallowed by vines and thyme. It had once been their mother's sacred place, where she prayed, healed the sick, and spoke to the spirits when words between humans failed. Noni had forbidden Amelie from visiting it after their mother's death, claiming it brought bad omens. But now Amelie felt drawn to it as if something, or someone, were calling her back. When she reached the clearing, the hut looked smaller than she remembered. The thatch was thinning and the wooden posts leaned like tired elders. Yet as she approached, a faint scent of herbs and smoke lingered, impossible after all these years. Amelie hesitated at the doorway, her hand hovering over the curtain of dried grass. Then she whispered softly, "Mother? I've come to listen." Inside, the air was thick, still holding the weight of countless prayers. Sunlight filtered through small cracks in the roof, forming thin beams that danced with dust. At the center of the room lay the wooden altar, worn but untouched. And upon it, half hidden under a faded cloth, was a carved bowl. Amelie reached for it carefully, her fingers trembling as she lifted it into the light. The bowl was old, smooth from years of handling, but its edges were etched with markings, symbols she recognized from her mother's teaching. They were not simple decorations. They were words of binding, protection, and silence. Around the rim, she traced one line that made her breath catch. "When lies rule the house, truth hides in silence." Her mother's voice rose again in her memory, soft yet firm. "Amelie, if ever you feel the house grow colder than the rain, seek the truth in the bowl. It will speak when hearts can no longer listen." As she held it, the air shifted. The hut seemed to breathe. A faint hum filled the space, not from her but from the bowl itself. She saw, in a flicker of vision, her mother kneeling before it years ago, weeping into its hollow. And behind her, a shadow, a man's outline, their father. He stood by the doorway, silent, as their mother whispered his name with grief. Amelie gasped, nearly dropping the bowl. Her heart pounded. The memory wasn't hers, it was the hut's. The walls, the earth, even the air had remembered what had happened that night. She closed her eyes, letting the vision unfold. Her mother's voice whispered through the past, "He should never have gone to that river. The greed that took his life still lingers in this bloodline. And if one of you follows it, the house will curse itself." The image vanished. Amelie fell to her knees, clutching the bowl to her chest. So that was it. The dark root beneath Noni's hunger, the reason her mother's spirit had grown so restless. Their father's death had not been an accident as the family had always claimed. It was bound to betrayal, perhaps even within their mother's own house. The forest wind sighed through the doorway, carrying whispers that might have been her mother's spirit or the murmuring ancestors themselves. "You see now, child," it seemed to say. "Her rage is not only her own, it is the echo of an old deceit." Amelie stood slowly, the bowl still in her hands. Her tears fell silently into its hollow, mixing with the faint dust that lined the bottom. She looked around the hut one last time and whispered, "I will not let the lies grow roots again." As she stepped outside, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, though the sky above was clear. The storm was listening, waiting. Amelie clutched the bowl to her chest, feeling its strange warmth seep into her palms. The truth she had been forced to swallow was stirring again, not with rage but with power. When she walked back toward the village, she didn't notice Noni watching from behind a tree, her eyes narrowed, suspicion already forming. For the first time, Amelie's silence no longer felt like submission. It felt like the deep, dangerous calm before lightning splits the sky. That night, as the crickets hummed and the moon cast its pale light across the village, Amelie lay awake on her mat, the carved bowl resting near her side. She hadn't told anyone of her visit to the ancestral hut, not even the maid who brought her food. The secret pulsed quietly in her chest like a heartbeat she was afraid to let anyone hear. The air in her room felt heavier than usual, thick with the scent of rain that had not yet fallen. Then, just as her eyes began to close, she heard it, a faint murmur threading through the silence. It was not the rustle of wind or the sigh of trees. It was softer, slower, almost like breath-shaping words. "Amelie." Her eyes flew open. The sound seemed to come from the walls themselves, the clay and thatch whispering her name in tones that felt both tender and ancient. She sat up, her heart pounding, scanning the corners of the room. The small oil lamp flickered as though stirred by an unseen hand. Then another voice joined the first, older, weary but gentle. "Be still, child, listen." Amelie pressed a hand to her mouth. She knew that voice. It was her grandmother's, the one who had died before she and Noni were even grown. Then came another, a man's, low, trembling, carrying the weight of regret. The truth was buried, not forgotten. She clutched the bowl to her chest. The air around her began to shimmer, the shadows lengthening, curling toward her like smoke. When she blinked, she was no longer in her room. She was standing in a vast gray space where the wind carried the scent of earth after rain. Shapes flickered in and out of sight, ancestors cloaked in mist, their faces half-lit by unseen fire. The oldest among them, a woman with silver lines painted across her forehead, stepped forward. "You carry her silence," she said softly, her eyes reflecting storms. "Your mother sealed truth with her final breath, and now the winds carry what the living tried to hide." Amelie's voice trembled. "Tell me what I must do." But the spirits only murmured, circling her in whispers, "Listen. Watch. Do not speak until the time of breaking comes." Then, in flashes like lightning striking memory, she saw visions. Her sister Noni kneeling beside a chest, their father's chest, removing something wrapped in cloth. A bracelet, carved with symbols of lineage, glowing faintly. Then the vision shifted, their father standing behind her, his voice low but angry. "That is not yours, Noni. You know what it means to wear it." She saw Noni turn, defiant, her eyes cold. "You were never going to give it to me. You always favored her, the quiet one." Their father's hand shot out to snatch the bracelet, but the moment froze and the wind swallowed the rest in silence. The vision dissolved into a swirl of mist, leaving Amelie gasping for breath. "What happened after?" she whispered, desperate. But the spirits only retreated, their forms dissolving like smoke caught in rain. The last words she heard before waking were a warning. "The river remembers. When truth rises, the guilty will drown." Amelie awoke with tears streaming down her face, the room once again quiet. The lamp had gone out, and dawn's first light was filtering through the window. Her heart was racing, but her mind was clear, clearer than it had been in years. She finally understood that her silence was not a curse. It was her strength. She rose, walked to the window, and watched as Noni crossed the courtyard below, giving quick orders to the servants. Her movements were sharp, her laughter forced. Amelie studied her sister carefully now, the way her eyes darted when she thought no one watched, the way her hand rested possessively over the pendant she always wore beneath her dress. The voices of the ancestors still echoed faintly in her ears. "Be still. Listen." Amelie did not confront her sister. Not yet. Instead, she began to move differently, quieter, more observant. She noticed small things she'd once ignored. The hushed conversations between Noni and a strange man near the mango grove, the way she always locked their father's old room before evening, and how her laughter always stopped when thunder rolled in the distance. At night, the whispers returned, sometimes in the rhythm of the rain against the roof, sometimes in the flicker of the lamp. They told her fragments, warnings, pieces of truth waiting to be uncovered. One night, as she drifted between sleep and waking, she felt a presence beside her, gentle and familiar. Her mother's voice whispered, soft as wind through grass, "You were born with quiet strength, Amelie. Use it. The storm listens to you now." When she woke, the carved bowl had moved, no longer at her side, but on the window ledge, filled with dew though no rain had fallen. Amelie smiled faintly through her tears. The house itself was beginning to speak. And this time she was ready to listen. The sun rose over the village of Embry like an unkind eye, bright, watchful, and unblinking. Whispers traveled faster than wind, and before noon, Amelie's name was already tangled in their tongues. Noni had begun her work early that morning, her voice honeyed but sharp, weaving fear into gossip with every sentence she spoke. She no longer prays with the living, Noni told the women at the riverbank as they washed their clothes. At night she speaks to no one, but her lamp burns until dawn. Have you not heard? Spirits answer her call. By the time the sun reached its peak, Amelie was no longer the quiet sister. She was the one who called storms. The same villagers who once smiled at her as she passed now avoided her eyes. Mothers pulled their children closer, and old men spat softly into the dust to ward off curses. Even the market women, who had always given her warm greetings, now sold her the bruised fruit and stale bread, muttering prayers beneath their breath. Amelie bore it all with calm she did not feel. Each word cut deeper than the next, but she remembered what the whispers through her walls had told her. Be still. Listen. So she said nothing. She simply nodded when insulted, bowed her head when accused, and walked home with her small basket as if she hadn't heard their laughter following her down the road. Inside, behind the quiet walls of her mother's old hut, Amelie knelt before the carved bowl. The air there was different, cool, humming softly with unseen energy. The voices of the ancestors rose like wind through reeds, guiding her through the ache. Do not fight with their tongues, one voice said. Their words are like dry leaves, the rain will scatter them. Another voice, her mother's, whispered, Patience, my daughter. Silence grows roots in deep soil. It will bloom when the time comes. Amelie closed her eyes and breathed deeply. She had learned that every rumor was a kind of offering, not to her shame but to her strength. Each cruel word became something the ancestors could taste, turning bitterness into power. But Noni's cruelty did not stop at whispers. She began to visit Amelie's hut more often, pretending kindness before others but using each visit to remind her of her growing isolation. You bring this on yourself, she said one evening, stepping close enough that Amelie could smell the oil in her braided hair. You spend too much time alone staring at shadows. People will talk. And when they talk, even the ancestors will not save you. Amelie said nothing. Her silence seemed to anger Noni more than any reply ever could. You think you're wise because you listen to ghosts, she hissed. But remember this, spirits cannot protect you when the living decide to burn your house. When Noni left, Amelie sat by her window until nightfall, the carved bowl on her lap. Outside, the wind had begun to stir, carrying the smell of coming rain. They will turn against me soon, she whispered to the air. From the shadows, the familiar chorus replied, their voices woven through the rustle of trees. Yes. And when they do, let them hear the truth they have forgotten. Amelie frowned. But how? My voice is small. Your silence, said the wind, is not. That night, the sky cracked open with thunder. Amelie did not hide. She stepped outside and lifted her face to the rain, her body trembling from both fear and something deeper, awakening. She let the rain soak her clothes and hair as she whispered her mother's old words of binding. Let truth rest in silence until lies lose their breath. Lightning flashed, and for a brief second she saw shapes in the rain, her ancestors standing behind her, their outlines made of stormlight. The sight filled her with calm. When the lightning faded, she was alone again, but she no longer felt afraid. The next morning when she walked through the village, the whispers followed her still, crueler, louder, but she noticed something strange. Birds circled over her sister's roof, screeching, as if disturbed by something unseen. And the wind that carried the villagers' gossip now seemed to twist their words back at them. She spoke to the storm again, one woman whispered. Yes, but did you hear? Her sister's goats were found dead this morning, tongues black as soot. By midday, fear began to shift its shape. Suspicion started to turn inward, and the villagers' voices grew unsure. Amelie heard their confusion like distant music. The silence she carried was no longer weakness, it was spreading. It was power. That night as she sat alone, the ancestral voices returned, clearer than ever before. The time is near, child. When they shout your name, do not speak. Let the storm speak for you. Amelie smiled faintly, her fingers brushing the rim of the bowl. She had endured their cruelty. Now her silence was no longer something they could break, it was something that would break them. The sun had barely touched the horizon when the tension in the village square became palpable. The villagers gathered, some out of curiosity, others out of the quiet fear that always accompanied Noni's presence. Amelie stood in the center, her hands folded before her, her eyes lowered. Her heart pounded, not in fear of what might happen, but with the strange anticipation of forces she could not yet name. Noni stepped forward, her face flushed with anger and her fists clenched. "Do you think you can speak over me?" she spat, her voice carrying over the murmuring crowd. "Do you dare defy me, Amelie?" Amelie said nothing. She met her sister's glare with calm that seemed to irritate Noni even further. "Answer me," Noni shouted, raising her hand, striking Amelie across the face. The crowd gasped but held back. Fear, respect, and resignation had bound them to silence. No one intervened, no one whispered caution. They simply watched, as if witnessing a ritual that had been practiced 1,000 times in secret. The first blow drew blood. Amelie felt it slide slowly down her cheek, warm and sticky, but she did not flinch. Noni continued, each strike fueled by rage, by envy, by the desire to dominate what she could not control, the quiet strength of her sister. Amelie's body ached, her face burned, and yet inside she felt a strange tremor that had nothing to do with fear. As her blood dripped onto the earth, she knelt slightly, pressing her palms against the dusty ground. The soil seemed to pulse beneath her fingertips, faint tremors like a heartbeat. She sensed the ancestors, not distant or idle, but watching, vibrating in rhythm with the injustice being done. They had seen generations suffer under deceit and cruelty, and now they murmured beneath her touch, their whispers vibrating through the clay and stone of the village. Noni, unaware of the stirrings beneath her sister, continued her public display. "You will learn," she hissed. "Defiance is a sin in this house." But with every word, with every blow, a tension grew in the air, unseen by human eyes but tangible to Amelie's spirit. The wind began to shift, curling around the square in subtle swirls, stirring dust at the villagers' feet. Birds scattered in the trees, uneasy at some disturbance they could not name. Amelie's vision blurred, not from the pain but from a strange, rising awareness. The whispers she had learned to trust in the ancestral hut seemed to swell, flowing through the ground, through her body, binding her will. Each drop of blood that touched the earth was absorbed and transformed into something else, something quiet but potent. Truth long hidden was awakening. When Noni finally stopped, panting, her fists red with effort, Amelie rose slowly. Her face bore the marks of the beating, but her posture remained serene, almost regal. The villagers, shaken and uneasy, avoided her eyes, sensing that the simple act of enduring had shifted the balance of power in ways they could not articulate. That night, as the village slept uneasily, a low rumble rolled across the sky. Thunder growled without the accompaniment of rain. It shook the roofs, vibrated the walls, and whispered through the trees. Amelie lay on her mat, exhausted, bruised, but her heart steady. The ground beneath her hummed faintly, a confirmation that the ancestors had noticed, that the injustice had been witnessed. The air carried a promise, unspoken but undeniable. The storm had stirred not for destruction but for revelation. The seeds of justice had been planted in blood and silence alike. Amelie closed her eyes, listening to the distant rumble, feeling a quiet strength grow in her chest. She knew that the night's suffering was not the end. It was the awakening, the first tremor of truth ready to move through the hearts of those who had turned a blind eye. And so, Amelie endured, silent yet unbroken, as the ancestors whispered and the thunder rolled, carrying with it the warning that silence, patience, and resilience were now forces no one could ignore. Amelie moved silently through the village, her bare feet brushing against the rough dirt paths as she approached the ancestral hut at the edge of the forest. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky painted with bruised purples and deep indigos, as if the world itself were preparing for what was to come. She did not stop to greet anyone. The villagers, now wary after witnessing her beating, kept their distance. She carried no anger, no pleading, only the quiet determination that had been growing in her since the day Noni had struck her. Inside the hut, the familiar scent of earth and incense enveloped her. She knelt before the carved wooden bowl, placing her hands gently on its rim. The darkness was complete, save for the faint glow of the spirits that hovered in the corners of the room, waiting. Amelie bowed her head and began her fast, taking no food, drinking only the water collected from the morning dew. Hunger sharpened her senses, stripping her body of distraction and leaving her mind clear, open to the whispers she had long learned to trust. The spirits stirred, their presence moving through the hut like wind through reeds. A low hum filled the air, vibrating in her chest and limbs, as if the very walls were alive. From the shadows a figure emerged, her mother radiant and serene, eyes shining like molten silver. "Amelie," she whispered, "you carry the silence that will awaken the truth. But first you must learn the ritual of echoes." Amelie listened intently as her mother's voice guided her through movements and gestures, each precise, deliberate, and full of intention. She traced symbols in the air with her fingers, each movement mirrored by the spirits, each pattern forming a network of unseen threads connecting her to the past. The ritual of echoes, they explained, was a method to let truth speak through the silence, to allow lies to reveal themselves without a single word uttered. Through the ritual, one spirit murmured, "The voices of the guilty are drawn into the wind, and their falsehoods return to them like the river carrying the tide." Amelie's hands moved carefully, mixing ashes from the sacred hearth with water from the dew, forming a paste that she smeared along the thresholds of the hut. Each step she took was measured, each breath synchronized with the murmurs of the spirits. She closed her eyes and called upon the ancestors, feeling their energy swirl around her, binding her intent. The air thickened, charged with anticipation, as though the night itself held its breath. During the meditation, visions came unbidden. She saw Noni in the dim light of their father's study, tracing over parchments with careful, deliberate strokes. Her sister's hands were steady, but her eyes were fierce and possessive. Amelie's heart clenched as she realized the truth her spirit had long sensed. Noni had forged their father's will, claiming the inheritance that rightfully belonged to Amelie. The act had not only stolen her material legacy but had cursed the land itself, twisting the balance of the household and scattering deceit like seeds across the soil. The spirits guided her further, showing her how each act of malice, each whispered lie, was recorded in the air, in the walls, in the very bones of the village. They were not hidden from the eyes of the universe, only from those who refused to see. Amelie felt a deep calm settle over her, a certainty that the moment of revelation would come, and when it did, silence would speak louder than any accusation or cry. She stayed in the hut through the night, fasting and moving through the ritual with devotion, listening to the wind that whispered through the cracks in the walls, carrying fragments of conversations, hints of betrayal, echoes of greed. She absorbed everything, committing it to memory, shaping it within her, preparing for the night when the storm would carry the truth to the ears of all. By the time the first light of dawn touched the edges of the forest, Amelie was transformed. Her body was exhausted from hunger, her lips cracked and pale, but her spirit was vibrant and steady. The ritual of echoes had awakened something deep within her, a conduit through which the truth could flow without her speaking a single word. She stepped outside the hut and looked at the village sleeping beneath the mist. The wind stirred in the trees, carrying distant murmurs. Amelie inhaled slowly, letting the silence fill her completely. She no longer feared Noni's cruelty, nor the whispers of the villagers. The storm that would reveal the lies was approaching, and when it came, truth would no longer need her voice. With a final glance at the carved bowl, Amelie whispered softly, though not to anyone but herself, "Let the silence speak and let justice be heard." The air around her seemed to hum in response, carrying the promise of revelation, and Amelie, fasting, praying and ready, began her patient vigil for the storm that would change everything. The village of Embury was alive with celebration. Stalls of brightly woven cloths fluttered in the morning breeze, and the scent of roasted maize and fresh herbs filled the air. Children ran between the booths, laughing, their feet kicking up dust, while elders sat beneath the shade of baobab trees, recounting tales of old victories and the spirits that watched over the land. The festival, a centuries-old tradition, was meant to honor the village's ancestors and the blessings of the harvest, but for Amelie, it was the stage upon which a far greater reckoning was about to unfold. Noni strode through the crowd like a queen, her head held high, hair braided perfectly, and eyes glinting with pride. She spoke loudly to anyone who would listen, recounting her family's wealth and influence, flaunting the fruits of the inheritance she had stolen. Her voice was honeyed and commanding, drawing gasps and nods of admiration from the villagers, most of whom were oblivious to the deceit behind her success. She laughed freely, a sound that grated on Amelie's nerves not because it was false, but because it was arrogant and blind to the truth that lingered, silent, in the shadows. Amelie moved through the edge of the crowd, unnoticed, her eyes calm and steady. The glow of the afternoon sun reflected off her dark hair, but it was the stillness within her that truly caught the attention of the unseen. She did not raise her voice, nor did she make a show of her presence. She simply stood, observing, letting the air around her grow heavy with expectation, letting the power of patience and silence gather around her like storm clouds. As Noni finished recounting yet another tale of her supposed cleverness, the sky began to change. A faint darkness crept along the horizon, subtle at first, then rolling in waves, swallowing the blue of the afternoon. A hush fell over the villagers as shadows stretched across their faces. Birds fell silent in the trees, their cries replaced by a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the air itself. Then came the voices. At first they were indistinct, like wind whistling through hollow reeds, but gradually they became clear, precise, and unmistakable. The voice of Amelie's father echoed across the festival, deep and firm, cutting through the laughter and chatter. "Noni, you have taken what is not yours. You have forged my will, stolen my daughter's inheritance, and cursed this land with your deceit. Your greed will not go unnoticed." A gasp rose from the crowd. The elders froze in their tracks, eyes wide, mouths opening and closing as if the words themselves defied comprehension. Merchants dropped their wares and children clung to their mothers, unsure whether the booming, commanding voice belonged to the wind, to a spirit, or to some divine judgment. Noni's face turned pale, then red, then white as realization struck. Her eyes darted to Amelie, who remained perfectly still, calm and unwavering. A faint, ethereal glow seemed to emanate from her, soft and steady, like moonlight reflected on water. She did not raise her voice, she did not gesture, she did nothing but let the ritual of echoes do its work. The villagers began to murmur, pointing to the sky, to Noni, to Amelie. The truth that had been whispered in shadows and hidden behind doors now roared openly. Each lie Noni had spun, each plot she had executed, returned to her in the voices of ancestors and wind. Amelie's eyes met those of the elders. There was no pleading, no explanation, only a serene command, a message that silence could be louder than any accusation or scream. Noni stumbled backward, her voice breaking as she tried to deny the truth. "It's not real. You're lying. You cannot." But the voices continued, each one naming her betrayals, each one recounting her deception, her theft, her manipulation. The crowd fell silent, not out of fear alone but out of awe. They had ignored the signs for years, dismissed the quiet sister as weak, but now the undeniable justice of silence had overtaken them all. The ground beneath Noni's feet began to tremble slightly, as if even the earth itself acknowledged the judgment. Her knees buckled and she fell to the dusty ground, weeping, shaking, overwhelmed by guilt and terror. The villagers watched in stunned silence, some of them moving closer to Amelie, seeking reassurance, guidance, or perhaps simply to witness the power of patience and truth. Amelie remained still, her body a vessel through which the ancestors spoke. She did not gloat, did not laugh. Her face was serene, her eyes glowing faintly with the quiet power that had grown through suffering and endurance. The wind swirled around her, carrying whispers of old lessons, the murmurs of the ancestors praising the courage of silence. As Noni wept on the ground, her pride shattered, the sky began to clear, sunlight spilling gently over the village, reflecting on the faces of the humbled and the enlightened alike. The festival, meant to celebrate abundance and joy, had become a testament to truth, to justice delivered without a single raised voice. From that day on the villagers spoke differently. They remembered that words could betray, that silence could command, and that justice, once awakened, needed no speaker. Amelie turned and walked through the crowd, unchallenged, serene, a quiet force that had revealed the deepest lies without ever speaking, and the story of that day when truth spoke without a voice, would linger in Embry for generations. The forest loomed ahead, thick with shadow and the scent of wet earth. Noni ran without looking back, her breath ragged, tears mingling with the rain that had begun to fall in heavy sheets. Each step splashed through puddles, the cold water soaking her sandals, her skirts clinging to her legs. The voices followed her, echoing in her mind, repeating every word Amelie had never spoken aloud. She stumbled over roots, twisted her ankle, but the fear and guilt that coursed through her kept her moving. Amelie walked behind at a measured pace, the calm in her eyes unshaken by the storm around her. She did not call out, did not accuse, did not gesture. She simply followed, letting Noni's conscience, now awakened, guide her through the same forest where so many secrets had been buried. The trees, ancient and towering, swayed with the wind, their leaves whispering the echoes of the past, of every deceit and cruelty Noni had hidden beneath her beauty and charm. With every step, Noni's mind reeled. She saw herself in every shadow, every glint of lightning, every movement of the rain-soaked leaves. Her hands shook as she clutched at her skirts, trying to steady herself, trying to outrun the truth that had finally caught up. The voices of ancestors and spirits, of the village she had deceived, spoke without words, reverberating through the storm, relentless, unstoppable. Amelie's presence was a quiet anchor, a witness to the storm of guilt consuming Noni. She did not gloat, did not shout, did not revel in her sister's fear. Her silence was powerful, an unspoken command that Noni must face herself without interference. The forest seemed to guide them, roots and streams forming a path both treacherous and inevitable, leading Noni to the river where fate awaited her. The storm-swollen river roared ahead, swollen with weeks of rain, its surface broken by jagged rocks and swirling currents. Noni skidded to the edge, her reflection distorted in the churning water, eyes wide with terror. She could hear the whispers now, every betrayal, every lie she had whispered, every act of greed, naming her as she had named others. The river called to her, cold and merciless, promising a cleansing she did not yet understand. Amelie stopped a few paces behind, her expression calm, her eyes reflecting the dim light of lightning streaking across the sky. She watched as Noni hesitated, shivering not from cold alone, but from the weight of her sins finally laid bare. The wind carried the echoes of Amelie's quiet strength, and for the first time, Noni understood that the sister she had mocked, beaten, and tried to silence had always held power she could never hope to match. A sudden gust of wind swept across the river, rattling the trees and pushing Noni forward. She slipped on the muddy bank, her screams swallowed by the roar of the current, her hands flailing for purchase on rocks and reeds. The water claimed her, dragging her beneath its surface, pulling her along with a force she could not resist. The storm drowned her cries, the river swallowing her voice, just as she had once tried to drown Amelie's spirit with her cruelty. Amelie stepped closer, feeling the cold mist from the river, but she did not reach for her sister. There was no need. The forest and the storm had done what words could not. Noni's fall was not only physical but spiritual, a reckoning for every act of deception, greed, and malice. The water rushed past, cleansing the land as it cleansed the wronged balance of the family, washing away the shadows that had clung to Amelie's life for so long. The forest quieted slowly after the storm passed, the trees swaying gently, leaves dripping with rain. Amelie stood at the edge of the riverbank, silent and composed, eyes tracing the currents as if watching every secret sink into the depths. The river, now calm, reflected the first soft rays of morning light, carrying with it the cleansing power of nature and the justice of the ancestors. The villagers would later speak of the storm and the river, of how the proud sister had vanished and the quiet sister had endured. They would whisper that Noni's cries had been heard and answered, that the forest and the water had judged her as humans could not. And Amelie, ever still, had walked back through the damp woods, untouched by guilt or fear, a living testament to the strength found in patience, silence, and the unstoppable force of truth. Nature had spoken, and through it, the balance had been restored. The echoes of injustice faded, leaving only the quiet, resolute power of the sister who had listened, endured, and allowed the world itself to reveal what words could not. Years had passed since the storms, the river, and the reckoning that had changed the village of Embry forever. Children no longer feared the shadows beneath the baobab trees or the dark corners of the ancestral hut. Instead, they listened carefully, learning to hear what others could not. Elders told stories of Amelie, the silent sister, in hushed tones beside the fire, her legend woven into the very fabric of their lives. She had become more than a woman of flesh and blood. She was a symbol, a lesson carried through generations, a quiet force that had taught the villagers that strength often hides in the calm, the measured, and the patient. The old hut at the edge of the forest still stood, weathered but unyielding. Its walls, etched with the marks of time, carried the memory of rituals, whispers, and enduring vigilance. On windy days, the children would hear the faint murmurs that seemed to echo from its windows and cracks, the remnants of the ritual of echoes Amelie had performed so many years ago. It was said that if one listened closely, the wind would carry not only her voice but also the whispers of ancestors, teaching lessons of fairness, patience, and courage to those willing to understand. Villagers spoke often of the lesson Amelie had imparted without ever raising her voice. She had endured mockery, violence, and deprivation, yet she had never faltered in her composure or her determination. Her silence had not been weakness but strategy, a way of observing the truth while the world revealed itself in fragments and murmurs. Through storms and shadows, through blood and fear, she had learned that power could manifest in listening, in endurance, and in patience. Every year, during the festival that celebrated the harvest and the blessings of the ancestors, the story of Amelie was recounted with reverence. Elders would gather the children beneath the baobab trees, their faces etched with lines of wisdom, and begin, "There was once a sister who suffered, yet never cried out. She listened when others spoke, she endured when others struck, and she watched when others plotted. And when the time came, truth emerged without a sound, louder than any shout, sharper than any sword." The children, eyes wide and attentive, would lean closer, imagining the night of the storm, the voices in the wind, and the sister who had stood calm and unwavering as justice itself unfolded. Some would whisper questions: could silence really be stronger than words? The elders would smile, nodding knowingly. "Remember this," they would say. "Strength is not always in the voice. Sometimes, it lives in patience, in observation, and in the quiet heart that lets the world reveal its own truths." The villagers who had once been spectators to Noni's downfall spoke differently of courage and justice after Amelie's example. They learned that confrontation was not always necessary for the revelation of truth. They observed the power of subtlety, the strength of moral resolve, and the significance of listening. Even those who had once doubted Amelie's endurance came to understand that her calm had reshaped the balance of their lives, that her patience had held the key to uncovering treachery and restoring integrity to the village. In the evenings, when the wind blew through Embry, it carried the faint rustle of leaves, the distant murmur of the ancestral hut, and the echoes of Amelie's silent vigilance. It was as though the earth itself had adopted her lessons, teaching anyone willing to hear that wrongs cannot remain hidden forever. The village remembered that the silence of the observant and the patient was not empty, it was filled with power, with awareness, and with the weight of inevitable justice. Over time, Amelie became more than a person in memory, she became a proverb, a guiding principle whispered from parent to child. Parents would warn their children gently, "Beware the silence of the wronged, for even silence remembers." It was a saying that transcended mere fear, it was a moral compass, a reminder that cruelty, deceit, and injustice do not vanish simply because they are unspoken. Every act of wrongdoing leaves a mark, and those who endure with patience and clarity will ensure that it is not forgotten. Even the youngest villagers learned to respect the quiet moments, the unspoken truths, and the importance of listening. They noticed how the wind carried secrets from one edge of the village to another, how it seemed to respond to their actions, reflecting honesty and integrity back upon them. The children grew up understanding that silence could be a shield and a sword, a refuge and a weapon. They learned to discern the world's hidden currents and to recognize that justice sometimes arrives not with thunderous clamor, but in the steady, persistent flow of truth. Amelie herself was seldom seen in the later years. Occasionally, a villager would glimpse her walking silently along the riverbank or tending the edge of the ancestral hut, but she never spoke of the events that had transformed her life. Her legacy lived not in tales she told, but in the lessons she had embedded into the village itself, through her actions, her patience, and her unwavering observance. She became the quiet guardian of truth, her presence felt in every gust of wind, every whisper through the leaves, and every careful observation of the children learning the old ways. And so, generations continued to honor her memory, recounting her story beneath moonlit skies and during storms that reminded them of the night when silence revealed what words could not. The wind still carried her whispers, the trees still echoed the lessons she had lived, and the proverb endured. "Dove, beware the silence of the wronged, for even silence remembers." Through her silence, Amelie had transformed from a woman wronged into a myth, a moral force that would forever shape Embry, guiding its people toward integrity, patience, and the understanding that true power often speaks not in sound, but in the steadfastness of a quiet, vigilant heart.